Spring arrived on Friday, and it brought summer temperatures, too. Today, our program is competing with the NCAA basketball tournaments and the final day of spring break, so thank you all for coming. You get a special welcome for attending our Community Speaker Program 2026. The men play at 6:10 today. The women play at 1 p.m. on Monday. Master Gardeners launched our education series in 2014 to fulfill our mission of research-based horticulture, gardening knowledge, information, and practices for education. We renamed the series in 2024 to encourage the public to attend our activities, programs, and projects. We thank our supporting sponsor, Hills Bank, and Ty and Lily at the City of Iowa City for live streaming the program and videotaping. The video will be available on the city's YouTube channel. Thanks also go to Shannon Balicki for her assistance, and Master Gardeners Brandy Jansen, Sharon Jeter, Marcia Bollinger, and Cindy Parsons for their assistance. Working in tandem with Project Green and Johnson County Conservation, ISU Iowa Master Gardeners, our volunteers, can accrue all of their education requirements without any cost. Today, each speaker will present for approximately 50 minutes and will then take your questions. The audience, both in-house and online, won't be able to hear your questions unless you step to the microphone. So please avoid walking near the cameras. Videographers are using a wide-angle lens, and we don't want to capture on film your awkward moments ducking because they will be shared for all to see. Evaluation forms have been placed on your table. Please complete them for each speaker and return them to me. Restrooms and drinking fountains are in the hallway. If you haven't already, please silence your cell phone. If I were to name today's program, I would call it Nature in Iowa. Today, our speakers are covering beneficial insects and natural enemies, gardening for all seasons, and nature is good for you, and we have a great lineup. Bugs can be good and bad. They outnumber humans, and they exist in almost every environment. About 1.5 million insects have been identified. I wonder how many haven't. 97% of insects are beneficial, innocent bystanders, or food sources for wildlife. They perform crucial ecological roles like pollination, think bees and butterflies, decomposition, beetles and flies, and pest control, ladybugs and praying mantis, making them vital for healthy ecosystems and food webs. Bad bugs are pests that harm crops or transmit disease, but they even serve as a food source for beneficial insects or wildlife. In nature, all insects have a purpose. Good or bad is a human-centric viewpoint of how they affect us. Our first speaker, Zach Schumm, is an insect diagnostician at Iowa State University. He is passionate about conservation and helping people see the value in even the most misunderstood insects. He will help us with identification and issues around the word pest. He turned a fascination with insects into a career dedicated to entomology, diagnostics, and conservation. Zach might agree with ecologist Doug Tolomei. He actually studied under him, and I'm so jealous, who revealed in his books an unbreakable link between native plant species and native wildlife. Native insects cannot or will not eat alien plants. When native plants disappear, the insects disappear, impoverishing the food source for birds and other animals. As development and habitat destruction accelerate, there are increasing pressures on wildlife populations. Please welcome Zach.
Hey, thanks for having me here. I was mentioned to be careful in front of the cameras to avoid any awkward moments, and I feel like my whole presence is awkward, so we're off to a pretty good start there. I'm going to talk about beneficial insects, natural enemies in the garden, and before I get started with this, I always have to kind of put a pause on our expectations for the talk because I'm an entomologist. I've been doing this ever since, ever since I was a kid, really. And I'm going to talk a little bit about identification. common insects that we find in the garden that are beneficial. We're going to talk about pests a little bit. And I'm going to tell you guys about some very common groups of insects that you're definitely seeing in the garden. But the problem with this is that I've spent a whole career learning how to identify things, and by all intents and purposes, I'm still a beginner at this too. Like, I'm never going to be alive long enough to know everything that's out there. So my expectation for you all is to not be able to identify all the insects in your garden if most of the insects in your garden. That's not the goal here. So after I give you guys a rundown of the insects that we'll commonly see, it'll give you a couple of identification tips and tricks, but you'll probably still have the experience of going out into your garden and looking at something and being like, I have no idea what that insect is. And that's okay. I still do that all the time. I'm constantly seeing insects I've never seen before. I just have a little bit more experience with learning how to identify them. Oftentimes it requires microscopes, right? And I'll get a little bit more into that as we go on. So we're going to talk about some of these common beneficial insects in the landscape, ones that you're definitely seeing out in the garden, whether you realize it or not. Go over some identification tips and tricks, if there are any, and then talk about their biology, generally speaking, why they're considered beneficial. But then I'll also talk about why I would even include the pests that we often identify as pests or call pests are often beneficial in their own way. So we'll have some time for questions at the end. I always encourage a lot of questions, so I tend to zip through things, and I want to answer your questions because you guys want to know specific things, and I'm here right now. So before we get started with any of the identification, I do want to sort of define beneficials and pests. Since we're in a kind of a room where we're recording and people online won't be able to hear unless you're at the microphone, I'll kind of define these, or what I normally hear from people that are contacting me in the diagnostic clinic. Beneficial insects, we hear the common things: pollinators, predators, parasites, things of that nature. So that's like the very common thing that we like to hear. But what about a pest? And the things that we normally hear from the pest standpoint are things that are just annoying to us. If there's like wasps, paper wasps flying around the garden, things that are consuming our plant material, things like aphids or grasshoppers that are chewing away leaf tissue. If your focus in your own landscape is gardening and having a pristine looking garden, then a grasshopper that's feeding on your leaves, you would probably consider a pest, definitely more than you would consider it a beneficial. So those are the normal things that we tend to hear. But to kind of engage in this conversation a little bit more, insects can very commonly be both beneficial and, by our normal definition, pests. Butterflies are a really common example. We all tend to enjoy butterflies in the garden, and we can understand their beneficial qualities as pollinators, as nectar-feeding insects, as food sources for other wildlife, birds, insects, etc. But that same exact species can be feeding on your plants as a larval stage. You would look at it and say, I want to get this off of my plants because it's clearly defoliating my plants in my garden. So we appreciate the adult stage of that insect, but we kind of hate or give some hate towards the immature stage of that insect. Blister beetles, I'll show some pictures of blister beetles if you've never heard of them before. Another one where as immatures, they're very beneficial. They are feeding on grasshopper eggs. And we all tend to hate on grasshoppers a little bit, whereas as adults, they can feed on plant material and completely defoliate potatoes, for example. So there's a lot of insects, and I would argue many insects, where depending on your personal viewpoint, all of us probably have a slightly different viewpoint, that's perfectly fine. It can be both beneficial and a pest in some way, shape, or form. So, and where this goes is like, I kind of hate the word pest. You'll hear me use the word pest throughout this talk. That's perfectly fine. Like, they're words, we make them up as humans. So it's okay to use the word, you'll hear me do it, but I kind of hate the energy that surrounds the word pest because it identifies that insect as just something that's generally bad, and that's not always the case. So if we're talking about the word pest versus beneficial insects, I often like to use these little tips and tricks. And again, I'm going back to like the ways that we generally define them, things that are feeding on our plants versus things that are not. There's ways that you can more easily identify them in the landscape. With a pest, you're more often, at least in terms of home gardeners, we're going to see damage found on plants. If it feeds on a plant, we're more likely to identify it as a pest. But in the way to determine if that's something that's actually at pest status or something that is negative in your home garden is that you're more likely or more often than not going to be seeing more than one of those individuals in very close proximity to another. So you can have an insect that feeds on plant material. I could throw out a million examples. For example, there's over 150 species of stink bugs in North America. And they are plant feeding. They feed on fruits and they feed on vegetables and all sorts of things. But if you're only seeing one, it's not going to cause any amount of damage that you're probably even going to notice. So, but if you have your plant that's completely covered in stink bugs for whatever reason, then that would be something that would be more likely to reach pest status in that landscape. So, if you're seeing something in the landscape where you're seeing a bunch of them in close proximity, you're seeing leaf defoliation, more likely to be something that could actually be considered a pest, even though there's a million other species out there that are plant feeding. Things that are beneficial or things that are neutral in the garden, so something that you don't really have to worry about seeing in the garden, 99% of the time, they're often by themselves or in very small groups. So one of the most common situations that I get in the diagnostic clinic, because my job is to identify insects all day, is I'll see a picture from someone and either the insect is smashed, which is more than half the time probably, and then I often say that my job is trying to identify things that are crushed, and it's a weird random skill that I've probably developed. Or it's just something that, hey, I found this in my garden, I got rid of it, what is it? And it's something that I haven't seen in like a decade. And I think we have this energy around, like, if we don't know about something, if we have no information about what something is or what it does, we tend to be a little bit more worrisome if our focus in our landscape is home gardening or doing whatever kind of gardening you do. So I'm probably a little bit different than a lot of people in this room. When I garden, I don't care if insects are eating all my plants because I find them fascinating. If you're growing to harvest things from them, if you're growing to have a really aesthetic garden, you're probably going to care a little bit more about what that plant looks like than I do, and perhaps be a little bit more concerned about finding an insect you don't recognize. So my goal here is not to teach you how to identify all the insects, because I'm not even there yet, and I've been doing this for well over a decade professionally at this point. But it's to just sort of appreciate those things and give you some tips and tricks on how to take action if you see things in your garden. So going back to that thing where pests, you often find a bunch in close proximity, these situations are going to be more likely in that pest category. You're seeing a bunch of aphids there on the left, that you're seeing hundreds of them on the same plant. Everybody's favorite Japanese beetle there on the right. Those are the things that are more likely going to be, quote, pest status, or an insect that's capable of being, quote, a pest. That being said, that doesn't necessarily mean that just because they're plant feeding, that does not mean that they are problematic on that plant. For example, most plants can withstand pretty heavy populations of aphids on them. We see 100 aphids on our hibiscus or on our ash tree or whatever it is. We tend to panic and we tend to take action on that. And you can do that, that's perfectly fine in most cases, but you often don't have to. Aphids on trees, you can have thousands of aphids covering the branches of your tree and your tree is going to be perfectly fine. Japanese beetles, you can have a linden that's completely defoliated and your linden's going to be perfectly fine. So folks that are focused on aesthetics in the landscape and aesthetics in the garden, they tend to care a lot about seeing 2 Japanese beetles that have destroyed 1 branch. But you don't have to do anything about that particular case if you have Japanese beetles defoliating your linden. So just be mindful of that. Even though things can be, quote, pests, that doesn't mean that they're actually harmful to the plant or to the overall landscape. There's a lot of generalizing there because obviously Japanese beetles are non-native and we can hate them in that regard if we want to. But going back to pests versus beneficials, if you ever see an insect in the landscape that is, quote, by itself, or if you're seeing 1 or 2 of them, or if you're just going through the garden and you've never really seen that insect before, odds are it's not harmful to the garden. Again, we're generalizing because there are some insects that can transmit diseases, and technically some of that only takes 1 insect to transmit disease to a plant, but those are usually the things like aphids and thrips that are usually more numerous in the landscape. So things like spiders, that's an assassin bug there on the right eating something. I can't really tell what that is. And we'll go over some of these at the bottom, a lacewing on the bottom, and obviously praying mantis. So things that we're seeing by themselves. They're not in large clusters. That's typically the case. So my whole goal there is to just appreciate the beneficial qualities of things that are sometimes an inconvenience, or I'll just say ugly to us in the landscape. And to preface this, even though I'll talk about it a little bit later, why could pests be beneficial in the landscape? If you want to call it out, I'll repeat it for the people that are watching online. What could be a benefit of having pests in the landscape? Any ideas? So you can have some that we would consider pests be pollinators, like Paper wasps could be a good example of that. I mean, they do feed on nectar, and they can transmit pollen, and they can sting us. They're also really good predators. So that's another one that is both a pest and beneficial, depending on how you look at it. What about if we're talking about, I mean, has anybody ever, you can just raise your hand or just nod or whatever, has anybody ever tried to like release ladybugs in the garden or heard of releasing ladybugs in the garden? A lot of us. Side note, not often the best idea to do that, but that's okay. But let's say you release ladybugs into your garden and there are no pests present. What's going to happen to the ladybugs?
Go away.
They're going to leave. So if you don't have any food material for beneficial insects or any host material for beneficial insects, there's no reason why beneficial insects would stay in that landscape long term. So if you completely eliminate your pest, it's unlikely that your landscape is going to support a very large number of sustained beneficial insect populations. Again, I'm generalizing. I'm thinking of a million scenarios why that's incorrect in my head. So just bear with me there. So I'm going to go through some beneficial insects now. Again, my goal here isn't that you'll be able to identify all of these because there's so much diversity. I'm going to go over some different families of insects. So if we think of, let me find a good example. Brush-footed butterflies is a family of butterflies that includes things like the monarch and the viceroy, which is the monarch lookalike. So we're going to talk about families of insects. There's a ton of diversity within each one of these families that I'm going to be talking about. So I'm going to tell you about their general shape, what you generally expect to see in the landscape, but we'll never be able to identify all of them. So we're going to go over the predators first, and then we're going to go over some parasites, or really parasitoids. I'll talk about what that is a little bit later on. Generally speaking, predators are ones that are directly feeding on an insect, and a parasite that is something that lives either on or in an insect, or a host in general, that essentially kills off the host at its own benefit. So again, we'll go into some more detail, and it'll make more sense once we get there. I differentiate them in the categories because they just differentiate a little bit in how they behave in the landscape. Predators are usually generalists. They don't really care what they're consuming. Again, generalizing here. Most of them are directly feeding on many different types of insects. So for example, a spider doesn't really care if it's eating a grasshopper or a bee. It doesn't discriminate. It just finds something that it can get its fangs on, and it consumes it. And again, these are often less abundant in the landscape than plant-feeding insects. As general predator-prey dynamics, there's always more prey than there are predators. Again, generalizing. We're going to start with the beetles. As it was mentioned earlier, insects are one of the most diverse groups of organisms out there. There's about 400,000 described species. That's probably quite outdated at this point, because even I made this slide is like, I think, 2 years old. Probably a very outdated metric at this point. And what I really love about a lot of the insect groups that we're talking about today is there can be different types of life histories within these different groups. There are parasitic beetles, there are plant-feeding beetles, there are predatory beetles. Different types of beetles have a bunch of different life strategies. So again, we're never going to get through all these. So I'm just going to go over the big, large groupings, the families of beetles that you definitely are seeing in your garden with or without realizing it in the first place. So the first one are ground beetles. Probably one of the most common ones that you guys are seeing out there, but just kind of depends on where you're looking and how much you're digging in the soil. As the name would suggest, these are on the ground, typically. They do have the ability to fly, at least in many cases, but they're pretty much feeding on, they don't discriminate against what they're feeding on. Anything that's smaller than them, but most commonly they're feeding on little tiny gastropods. They can feed on snails, slugs, things of that nature. But really any soft-bodied or small insect that's on the ground in the soil. They can climb up plant material a little bit, but generally you tend to see them crawling across the ground, hence the name. And this is the part where you're going to start to probably get a little bit confused, and that's fine because I'm going to give you some identification tips, and then they may or may not make a lot of sense, and you'll try to get out in the garden and be like, that may or may not be a ground beetle. I have no idea. That's okay that you still don't have any idea. That's why I am employed, and you can send me pictures of things so I can give you a confirmation on that. Because we're looking up at these pictures right now, and we can see that there's a ton of diversity. Again, there's like thousands of species of these, right? So we have one at the top there that's called a tiger beetle. These are kind of small and cylindrical. They have really long legs, and they're incredibly fast. So it's always really entertaining trying to catch these because like you end up like leaping at them and falling on the ground and then you miss it. And then if you're in public, it's really embarrassing. But there's also different colors of those tiger beetles. There's some that are really shiny green. There's one here called the six-spotted green tiger beetle, and it's that exact shape, but it's really shiny green. We have the one on the bottom left there that's completely black, also cylindrical, kind of flattened, and then we have some more colorful, larger ground beetles. That one there on the right is probably about an inch long, inch and a quarter long. So lots of size differences, lots of shape differences, and certainly color differences. But what I normally tell folks is that you're definitely seeing ground beetles in the garden or when you're outside. What you typically experience is you have a beetle that looks exactly like the one on the bottom left. They're typically black in color or brown in color or just very dark in color. They're flattened and they're walking across the ground. If you're in the garden and you see something that's an oval, it's flattened, and oftentimes you can't really see them in these photos. Maybe the one at the top. We have those, there's little sharp points that are coming out of the front of the face. You see that little white marking, and there's little mandibles coming out the front of it. So oftentimes ground beetles have mandibles that are pretty easily seen sticking out of the front of the insect. Again, we're generalizing here, but if you see something that's clearly an oval shape and it's walking across the ground, and sometimes you can poke it if it doesn't fly, it very likely could be a ground beetle. But again, generalizing. Very common in the landscape. The other group that I tend to see, or you definitely are seeing in the garden, are the rove beetles. This is where we start to get a little bit confused because what other insect do these beetles look like? Any guesses? You want to call it out? Any other insect that we really hate? So some cockroaches a little bit. Is there any other like really skinny insect that has like pincers on the back of them?
Earwigs.
Earwigs. So these are often, so when you're going through entomology courses in college or wherever you're doing it, this is one of the first ones that they try to trick you on, like your first freshman year, and they put it on a quiz, and they're like, what group of insects is this then? And like a lot of these species look exactly like cockroaches if you don't know some of the identification features. So rove beetles, again, are very common, very diverse. Luckily, they're all very skinny and long. So they're very cylindrical, very flattened, very skinny and elongate, just like an earwig. So really the experience with these is you would look at one in the landscape and you would say, well, that looks like an earwig without giant pincers. It kind of looks like it has some little things coming out the tip of the abdomen. But if they're not giant pincers, like you see on a typical earwig, it's most likely a rove beetle. So in this case, we have these wing pads. I don't know if my cursor shows up on there. No, it does not. So they have these really hardened wing pads. It's hard for me to point out without a laser or something like that. But essentially, they do have fully formed wings. They have the ability to fly. They're attracted to lights at night. So if you keep your porch light on, you're probably getting a bunch of rove beetles at your lights. And some of them are very, very tiny. So this little measurement here is 1 millimeter. So some of these are 2 to 3 millimeters long tops. Other ones are several centimeters long. So again, a lot of diversity in the family. The good thing about rove beetles too is that they're beneficial in multiple ways. A lot of them do directly eat other insects, pest insects, whatever thing feeding on your plants that you don't care about, it probably eats it. But some of them are also very good at feeding on decaying organic matter. So they are recycling organic matter within the garden as well. So oftentimes finding on the ground as well. You'll see them crawling across the ground. But again, the difference is these are very cylindrical, very long. They look like an earwig, whereas most ground beetles are a little more circular, a little more oval shaped. But again, challenging because they're very diverse and there's so many insects that are out there. Another favorite one, I brought these up earlier, one that has both beneficial and pest qualities depending on what life stage you're looking at. These are adult blister beetles up on the screen here. There is some diversity in the family, but most often they look exactly like the one on the right. These are very good grasshopper predators as an immature stage. So I've never seen a larvae of a blister beetle, but they're little worm-like things that are living in the soil. Grasshoppers lay their eggs in the soil. The larvae are under there just consuming those grasshopper eggs. But the adults can feed on leaves. We get a lot of reports of them feeding on, some like fruit trees I've seen some species feeding on, but definitely like potato. That's like the common offender here in Iowa, at least that I've seen. We don't have that colorful one here in Iowa. I try to put the colorful ones up just because they look kind of cool. But there are some different colors too. We have a green species here. But the thing about blister beetles, at least for identification purposes, is that if you see this species on the left, it's kind of distinct. It has a giant abdomen on it. You can't really mistake that for anything else. The beetle itself is about 1.5 inches long and essentially looks exactly like that. So if you see that, it's a blister beetle. There are some other species that I could never tell you how to identify. And to preface this, when it comes to me identifying these things in the diagnostic clinic, I'm putting them under microscopes and doing things like counting the toe segments. So that's why I could never teach you in a 50-minute course how to identify some of these things, because even I have to put a lot of things under microscopes. If I go back to the ground beetles, the way that I have to confirm things as ground beetles is I have to flip them upside down, and I'm looking at a little suture that connects two parts of its thorax that, like, you have to shine the light on it just right, and like you have to zoom in just far enough. So again, if you ever get confused and be like, this guy's not teaching me anything about insect identification, that's because it's hard and it's impossible to do in 50 minutes. But again, I'm trying to put up some things that are more obvious. If you see one that looks exactly like the one on the right, it's a blister beetle. Kind of hard to mistake. Everybody's favorite, we all know the ladybug. So I'm going to kind of breeze through this one pretty quickly. I do like to mention that the one that we most commonly see here in Iowa and really throughout most of North America is the Asian lady beetle, Asian lady bird beetle, whatever you want to call it. So that's a non-native species. It's pretty easy to identify most of the time because it has that M-shaped black marking on its, I'm just going to say its thorax, right behind the head. Obviously, it looks like a W if you're looking the other direction. That is often what we see, and if you do see that, it's the Asian ladybird beetle. There's a chance, a very small chance that that's incorrect, but it's going to work basically every single time. The problem with that, though, too, is that the Asian lady beetle can be quite diverse in its color and pattern. So you can have the same species that sometimes are spotless, sometimes they're more yellow, sometimes they're more orange, but more often than not, you always see that little M shape. So give a look out for that. If you see that M shape, it is the Asian lady beetle here in Iowa. We have a lot of native species as well, and this is another good time to plug. I mean, you guys can call it out if you want to. So we have Asian lady beetles here that, that are predators. They feed on aphids. They feed on small insects in the garden, things like thrips, but primarily aphids. So we have this non-native species that is feeding on things that are feeding on our plants. So they're providing that beneficial quality there. But we also know that Asian lady beetle outcompetes some of our native species, like the one on the left, which is the convergent lady beetle. So is the Asian lady beetle beneficial or is it not? And you can just throw, if it's beneficial because it's feeding on pests, but it's not native and outcompetes native species. So what the heck is it? So this is part of this is why this is confusing and challenging. Every person in this room can probably have a different answer to that question, and there would be validity to it. So for me, I'm like a native insect person, so I just try to appreciate that it's still providing some kind of service to us in many cases, but I'd probably rather it not be outcompeting native ladybug species, but that's just how I feel. You could have a very different feeling, and I'm here to tell you that that's okay. I think there often is some I don't want to say aggression, but there's just some anger in this realm where it's I'm a native plant guy or I'm a native insect guy or I want to catch those and release them. It's okay, even if I have opinions about it. So immature ladybugs, just in case you haven't seen them, there are some other things that have eggs that look like little yellow cylinders on plants, but that is exactly what they look like. If you just haven't recognized the guy on the right, you've probably seen them in the garden. That's the immature stage of the ladybug. Pretty much all ladybug species have that same shape of larvae, but sometimes they can be different colors. The one that we see that's orange and black, it's probably the Asian lady beetle. There are a couple of other species that look very similar to that, but that's what they look like 99.9% of the time, and 99.9% of the time, it's the Asian lady beetle. But again, appreciate their beneficial qualities while also kind of getting mad at them for outcompeting native species. That's what I do. But native species don't get into our homes and annoy the crap out of us in the fall. So there's that perk too. So true bugs, this is kind of my bread and butter because I did my research for my master's on stink bugs, primarily the guy on the right there, which is the brown, the brown marmorated stink bug. So I'm not going to go into too much depth on that, but has anybody, just raise a hands, gotten the brown stink bugs in their house in the fall? In Johnson County, you guys probably are. Been bad. Yeah, so this area, I expected some hands. You can go to some other counties where they're like, I don't know what that is. So that's what I did my master's on. So if anybody wants to talk about them, send me an email. I'd love to keep talking about them for another 5 years. So stink bugs are in a group of insects called the true bugs. So this is not all, like a square is a rectangle, but not all rectangles are squares type thing. So like all bugs are insects, but not all insects are bugs. True bugs is like a large group of insects that is identified by their proboscis, which is their mouth part. So we can see it really easily there on the right. It's that one sticking straight out to the left. That's its proboscis, or its feeding mouth part. The one on the left is predatory, whereas the one on the right, the brown marmorated stink bug, has that one sticking straight down into that fruit there. So all true bugs are united by having that piercing, sucking mouth part, whether it's predatory or plant feeding or whatever. Predatory true bugs often have a much thicker proboscis. This is kind of just a random factoid because it's really hard to identify mouth parts in the field, other than a couple of examples I'm giving you. So this is the one on the left is a Florida predatory stink bug, where it's very obvious that it has a large mouth part. It's really hard to see that unless you're like looking, and they're like tucked under their bodies a lot, so you can't really see them unless you look really close. So it's a hard thing to use to help identify if it's predatory or pestiferous. But just note that that is the thickness of the mouth part is often helpful for a lot of these. I'm going to talk about stink bugs first. Mostly just to say, since you're in Johnson County, if you're seeing the little brown one that gets into the house, it's probably the brown marmorated stink bug. The way you can confirm that is actually quite easy in Iowa, at least for people living in the Midwest, which is nice. It's the only brown stink bug in the area that has white stripes on the antenna that is also brown in color as the insect. You can also probably just identify it by the fact that it's in your house and covering your deck in the fall and in the spring. That also works too. But there are some native species that look very similar otherwise. The one on the left there it's in the genus Podicis. It's a predatory species. And they are really beneficial in the garden. They're out there feeding on caterpillars, little larvae especially. I wouldn't say that they're exactly common, but they're definitely, in terms of like ecological, or the ecological side of things, they're very common in the landscape, but we don't see them that often. So just be mindful that if you're in the garden and you see a brown colored stink bug, just check for those little white stripes on the antenna. If it's a white stripes, you could remove that just fine and nobody would get mad at you for it. But if you don't see those white stripes on the antenna, I would argue that you should leave it there because it's either beneficial or it's a plant feeding one that probably isn't going to do any damage to your plants. Generalizing, because there's definitely some plant feeding species that are also brown out there, but I just don't see any problems with them in Iowa. So another thing about stink bugs is that they do tend to be the most shield-shaped true bug that we see out in the landscape. So they have like the 5 sides that make it look like a little shield. That's often very diagnostic. If you see something that's perfectly shield-shaped, like if you enlarged it a lot, you'd be like, yeah, I'd use that in a shield in a medieval battle. That is probably a stink bug. There are some others that are kind of shield-shaped, but they're elongate. I'll show you everybody's favorite, the squash bug. Anybody? Favorite insect? No? Just me? Just kidding. I don't really like squash bugs. Another one of my personal favorites are the assassin bugs. These are ones that you can often identify in the field based on its size and the shape or the view of the mouth part, which you can often see on these if you just get down and look at like the side. So we have one there on the left that is, and the circle is a little bit off on this presentation for some reason, but they tend to look like a squash bug in general shape. They're elongate, they're kind of shield-shaped, but they are very diagnostic in that they have these giant mouth parts, and I apologize, the circle's covering it a little bit, but it curves under the front of their body, and you can physically see the curve on the mouth part of these insects. And that is basically diagnostic for this family. We have an immature there on the right, so that one's a lot smaller, which is why it's kind of harder to see, but you can still see that thickened mouth part that is curled under the front of that. A little bit harder, so if you can't see it, it's fine. But definitely for the adults, like you'll see something that looks almost exactly like the one on the left. Larger insect, you're like, is that a squash bug? And then you look at that curved mouth part. Always going to be an assassin bug in Iowa. If I'm wrong, I don't think I'm wrong there. There could be a couple of really rare things out there. These are very good predators, though. They're feeding on larger things typically because they're larger insects. They'll be feeding on large caterpillars, anything that they can capture, basically. I was in Costa Rica, this is, probably 6 or 7 years ago at this point. And there was a assassin bug that was probably 1.5 inches long that was feeding on like a 6-inch caterpillar. And the caterpillar was just like hanging down from it was like all like guts getting sucked out of it. Pretty sad for the caterpillar, but yeah, they're very good predators. They're very powerful in terms of insects, but they always have that really thick and curved mouth part. So just be on the lookout for that. Everybody's favorite? Minute pirate bugs? Anybody? So these are, I'm not from Iowa. I'm from Maryland, and then I lived in Utah for a while for grad school. And then when I first got to Iowa, I was riding my bike on the High Trestle Trail, and I just like parked my car and I was unloading my bike, and like I just started getting bit like crazy. And then I learned very quickly that that's normal in Iowa in the fall. I'm fascinated by how painful the bites are for such a small insect, so I'll just like sit there and watch them. But I'm crazy, so but they're not going to hurt you, so it's fine. So I don't have to like belabor this too much. We all generally know what they look like. They're very tiny. They have that little black and white pattern, which weirdly is very easy to see on these. A lot of insects that are really tiny, it's really hard to see patterns, but because it's black, white, black typically, you can actually notice this. But I'm just here to say that minute pirate bugs are insanely beneficial. They feed on things like thrips. This one here on the left is feeding on a thrips. Fun fact, thrips is both singular and plural, so thrip is not a word. Fun fact. I got yelled at in college, that's why I bring that up. And then the one on the right here is feeding on an aphid. So very, very good predators. So we often one of the most common calls I get in the fall is like, what do I do to get rid of the minute pirate bugs? And it's like, well, 1, nothing, good luck. 2, they're really beneficial in the landscape. So what's happening is that they're in the agricultural landscape, they're feeding on all the pests that are in the corn and soybean fields. And as soon as those are harvested, they don't have anywhere to go. So they go to adjacent properties and adjacent landscapes, and then they just annoy us for a little bit. But there's absolutely nothing you can do. So this is a thing where I just encourage people to be like, they're really beneficial actually, like they're gonna go away, and then people get mad at me again, as they normally do. Can you tell I'm biased a little bit? Like, that's just kind of what happens. Another really funny one, a little bit bigger, but an even more painful bite than the minute pirate bug, is the damsel bug. So I often like to describe these as mini assassin bugs. So, and honestly, this is the only species that we see in Iowa. There could be another one or two hidden in there, probably, but this is the only one that we see. So it looks exactly like this. It looks like a mini assassin bug, and you can often clearly see that curved proboscis or mouth part again. In this one, you can see it on the left when you're looking at it from the side. So that mouth part is really skinny, and it's very long compared to the length of the body of the insect. So this whole insect is about a 1/2 inch long at max. Very slender, very long curved proboscis, very painful bites, even more fascinating than the minute pirate bugs. So if you ever have the chance to get bit by a damsel bug, very fascinating. Basically what it's doing is they have like little, I'm not a molecular biologist by any means, but they essentially have components of their saliva that's like melting your skin cells. Pretty cool. No? But again, very good predators of soft-bodied insects. They're going to be feeding on anything soft-bodied that's smaller than them, up to some bigger caterpillars, things of that nature. Very common in the landscape, especially taller grasses. So if you have any prairie around your property or wherever, very, very common in those. If you just walk through tall grasses and stuff, you'll probably get a couple attached to you, if you're lucky. Just some other random orders. So these are going to be things that are a little bit more diagnostic, so a little bit easier to identify these. Yay, we're at that point of the talk. But some things you might recognize, others that you might not recognize at all, and that's okay, because that's why we're here. So lacewings, these are already kind of out there. Has anybody seen any lacewings yet this year? They're one of the first things that come out once it gets above like 55, 60 degrees outside. I tend to see the green lacewing, which is the most common one we see just flying. They'll come to lights at night, very common there. They're very easy to identify though, because they look exactly like that one on the left 99% of the time. They're usually shiny green, maybe a little bit of a dull green, and they have those very net-like wings that are completely transparent, that are kind of netted over the side of the body. So very, very common insects out in the landscape. Turn on your porch lights probably next weekend when it gets warm again, and you'll probably find a couple of them because they're definitely out already. The larvae are predatory. They're feeding on things like aphids, thrips, soft-bodied things that are smaller than them. Adults sometimes feed on insects, but they're also feeding on honeydew and pollen, so kind of a multifaceted thing there. But they always have that net-like wing that's kind of tented over their body. We have brown lacewings too, and you'll find them. This one here is feeding on an aphid. You definitely see them. They're attracted to lights as well, but just way less common than the green ones. Again, you're going to see a lot of those green ones if you're paying really close attention in the garden. And if you don't see the adults, you're going to see the little alien immatures. So we have a larva here on the right that has giant mandibles on the front of it. They're kind of covered by the antenna, but you can see that top mandible there that's really sharp coming out of the front. And then on the left we have the eggs. Has anybody seen lacewing eggs before? If you probably will have them in your gardens if you're doing any sort of home gardening. So they're often on the underside of leaves, and they place their eggs on these little stalks, these little silk stalks. Really fascinating. Anybody have any guesses as to why they might do that? To keep them dry. I mean, sure. Yeah. I mean, so they are often on the bottom of leaves, so probably a little bit less likely for water to pool, but if they do put them on the top, that's going to be helpful for sure. What about, anybody else have an idea before I? Exactly, so they don't get eaten. So things like ants that would be walking around looking for protein sources, lacewings will lay them on the stalk so that ants can't really access them as easily. So you can have beneficial insects that are eaten by beneficial insects too, or beneficial insects that are eaten by pest insects, depending on what ant we're talking about. But very, very cool. You will be able to find those in your garden if you do a lot of plant inspections this summer. They're very common, but they are really tiny, so you often have to flip leaves upside down and kind of look at it from like the side, and you can often just see those little things sticking up on stalks. Very interesting. Some other ones that you definitely are aware of, so I'm not going to go over it. We all know what a praying mantis looks like, but if you go to other countries, they have really cool wasp mimics and other shapes and colors and fun stuff. We don't really have those here. So this one is a praying mantis on the right. It's just it's a wasp mimic. There's also ones that are like all shapes and colors that like camouflage with host plants that they like to hang out on. The ones that we see here look kind of like the one on the left. It's just so that species actually is a Chinese mantis. So very common. It's the large green one that we see here in Iowa. That's another example of it's definitely predatory, but it's also not native and may or may not outcompete other native species of praying mantises. So is that praying mantis good or bad? I don't know. Probably a little bit of both, and that's okay. We don't see them very often, but I often argue that they're out there. I think, so whenever I talk to a lot of folks about praying mantises, they often like find the egg case, and then they want to like leave it there in hopes that they have hundreds of little praying mantises running around. But predator-prey dynamics is a little bit more complicated than just hoping for that, because most of them are going to die. So if you have an egg sac that has 100 praying mantises in it, you can probably only expect a couple of them to survive to adulthood when you're actually able to see them easily. So, and that's because they'll be cannibalistic, they'll eat each other early on, other ones will just die from natural causes, or they'll get a disease, because insects can get sick like people can. And so they're out there probably, they're just not easy to spot, and it's hard to bring them in and just get them to establish in a location. So if you have a question, is it okay if we wait till the end, unless it's really quick?
Do they change color on their own?
So praying mantises, the question was for those online, is if they can change color on their own. They can't like change their color like in real time, so to speak, but they can change color as they grow a little bit, and depending on the sex of it. So males are going to look a little bit different than females. But other than that, there's no like active color changing other than maybe very subtle things. So short answer, no. Yeah, but there are different species out there too. So we have multiple species of native praying mantis that are not green, they're more of a brown color. But then the males of the Chinese mantis are also mostly brown, so it's kind of hard, but they don't change color. Good question. Now for my fun question. What's this guy? Any ideas? Looks like a wasp. Good. Does it look like anything else?
Prehistoric.
It looks kind of prehistoric. So this one, I can say they're not unfolded in this photograph, but it has raptorial front legs like a praying mantis would. So, but yeah, you said what it looks the most like. It looks like a wasp. This is actually, oh, I guess it's not on there, but this is actually a mantid fly, which is neither a mantis nor a fly. I didn't make the name up. So these are actually related to those green lacewings that I showed earlier. So they're a type of net-winged insect that are predatory and kind of act like a praying mantis in the landscape, but they just are a wasp mimic. There are some other species that are not wasp mimics as well. Very fascinating insects. If you find one, send me a picture, because I only ever see like one every 3 or 4 years, although you guys probably spend more time outside than I do these days. Very, very cool insects and beneficial, but you might look at that and suspect that it's a wasp and sometimes kill it. You guys are a little bit different than I think the folks that I talk to like the most frequently, where they just kill everything that they see. But very, very cool insects. I'll give some honorable mentions, things that we like to hate that are really beneficial in the landscape. Paper wasps are super beneficial. Hornets also. Fun fact, let me make sure I have clock access here so I don't go over. Hornets, there are actually no native true hornets in North America. So anything that you hear called a hornet, like a bald-faced hornet, it's actually a type of yellow jacket that just nests in the air. We don't have any hornets here. We do have a non-native hornet, which is a European hornet that is in the East Coast. We don't really have it this far west in Iowa. And then the northern giant hornet, AKA the murder hornet, was eradicated from Washington. Very uncommon for insects to get eradicated when they're non-native, so that's pretty cool. But paper wasps are very good predators. Ground nesting bees and wasps are also, well, mostly I'm talking about wasps here, very good predators. So if you ever are in the garden or you're outside just like grilling on your patio or something like that, and you see those paper wasps that are kind of like floating around you and hovering, they're just like scouting for food. They don't really care about you. They're flying into gardens and picking up grasshoppers and caterpillars and larvae, and they're taking them back to their nests to feed the immature stages. So if they're flying around you and just kind of like floating, you can just kind of ignore them. I've never gotten stung by doing that, and most people tell me that they've never gotten stung by doing that. Someone could raise their hand and tell me I'm wrong here. But once you start like reacting to, yeah, one in the back. Oh, bite, yeah. I guess that's a little better than a sting. But so they can. So these do pose risks. And when I'm talking about wasps in the landscape, like if you have paper wasp nests above your door or a bald-faced, quote, hornet nest hanging in a tree outside your house, usually the reaction, the method that I use to help people respond to those is, 1, how high up is the nest? 2, is it in a high trafficked area? And 3, maybe most importantly, is anybody in the house allergic to them? If you're in a situation where people are allergic or your pets are allergic and it's in a high trafficked area or it's low down, like it's okay to remove those things and like it really is. Like you should feel no guilt about doing that. Like even me as like someone who likes to save every insect, if my kid was allergic to bee stings or wasp stings, I probably wouldn't leave a paper wasp nest right above the exterior door to the house. So it's okay to do those things, but they are very beneficial in the landscape, just really good predators. I don't have to belabor spiders. We all know that spiders are good. We all save our spiders, right? Yeah. You guys are the group that would. Yeah, I appreciate that. And then centipedes too, very common. We just don't see them that often here in Iowa, but there are hundreds of species of centipedes living in the soil. A lot of them that we see in Iowa are really skinny like this, really flattened, really skinny and super long. Like they look way longer than they should be. Very good predators and feeding on things that are in the soil. I'm going on tangents, which is what I normally do, so I have 10 minutes. This should be enough. We'll find out. Next category are the parasitoids. I was saying earlier that beetles are one of the most abundant biodiverse groups of animals on the planet, but now we're starting to think that parasitoid wasps are the most abundant and diverse groups of organisms on the planet. So these are things or insects where the adult is free living, so you'll see an adult flying around like this parasitoid wasp or these parasitoid wasps here. But the larval stage requires a host insect for its own development. So a parasitoid is going to be laying its eggs on or inside another insect, and that insect is going to develop inside or on that other insect, kill it, and then emerge as an adult and fly on and repeat the cycle. So we have wasps that are the most common ones, but there are parasitic flies, there's parasitic beetles. In the sake of time, I'll just mention really quick that there's a parasitic butterfly out there, at least one. So lots of different organisms are parasitic. And I'll just give a couple of main examples just for the cool factor. I worked on parasitoids, which is why I probably love these so much. The most common one that we probably have out in the landscape, I don't know if that is strictly true, are aphid parasitoids that cause these little aphid mummies. So we have this aphid parasitoid wasp there on the left. You can see its little ovipositor, which looks like a stinger, but it's just an egg-laying structure, laying its egg into the aphid. That little immature wasp is going to develop inside the aphid, and then it's going to kill the aphid and chew its way out, a perfect circular hole that it chews, and then it's going to emerge from the aphid as a fully formed adult wasp and repeat the cycle. This is very common in the landscape. So if you have a tree or a plant with a lot of aphids on it, before you just like remove that foliage, take a look at them and see if you have any that are looking like the one on the right. I realize they're tiny, but they all tend to be a little bit swollen. So you're like, that aphid looks a lot chunkier than all the other ones. And you can often see a perfectly circular hole in it. So that's just aphid parasitoids doing their work. Another one, and this is where my expertise is, are stink bug parasitoids. So this, going back to this one, this is like an adult parasitoid where the insect is parasitizing the adult stage of the insect. There are also egg parasitoids, so parasitic wasps that are laying their eggs in the eggs of other species. So these are stink bugs. So we have some stink bug eggs here, the little green ovals on the left. And we can see that ovipositor, which looks like a stinger, laying an egg in the stink bug egg. And then I have a little time lapse here of that wasp that has developed inside the stink bug egg, feeding on all the stink bug juices. And it will slowly chew its way out of the stink bug egg as a fully formed adult, beautiful little wasp. And I just find this fascinating. And this is happening all around us all the time. I mean, this is one of the most common life histories in the insect world. We just never see it because it's so small. Yeah. I mean, there probably have been. I should know more. I don't watch a lot of like movies, so like someone's probably made a movie about similar things. But very fascinating. So just be on the lookout. And this is kind of going back to the beginning where we don't necessarily want to. Well, I'm gonna hold off on that point because it's kind of the grand finale. Squash bug parasitoids, they are out there. The most common one is probably this little tachinid fly, which is the guy there on the right. If you are really interested in squash bugs, you can pick all of them up and look for these little tiny eggs that are on them. They're little tiny white circles that are just stuck to the side of the squash bug body. They're not super effective at like getting rid of the squash bugs though, which you've probably experienced, but they are out there. So just be mindful of that. And I'm not going to belabor the other beneficial insects because we all are very familiar that pollinators are good. Just be mindful that flies are pollinators, there's beetle pollinators, and there's a lot of decomposers out there that we don't give a lot of credit to, like a little dipleuran insect on the left. There's no really good common name for them. Flies, grubs, very good decomposers, even though we tend to hate them. So just be mindful that things can be both beneficial and pestiferous depending on the thing. Most things are beneficial in at least one way. So in the last few minutes here, and I want to leave a couple of minutes for questions too, ways to help natural enemies, obviously eliminating or limiting chemical use. If you have to use insecticides, using things that are safer like insecticidal soap or horticulture oil. And then plant diversity. Flowering plant diversity is critical to allowing beneficial insects to reach and establish in a landscape. I'm going to go through this quick just so I have some time for questions here. And this is all done through integrative pest management. So integrated pest management, or IPM, is choosing the best possible way to manage an insect pest while preserving environmental quality and saving on costs. And beneficial insects are already doing a lot of the work, but I think we like to resort to chemical use, or maybe not you in this room. You guys are more in tune with how to do things effectively. But we don't just want to identify an insect and then pick a spray off the shelf. That is a very common practice throughout the general populace. And we try to limit that. So if we think of how pests are naturally managed in the landscape, things like weather, a hurricane comes through or a really bad storm, it's going to directly kill insects. They need the same resources we do, food, water, shelter. So if they don't have those, or if that's limited, it's going to cut down on insect numbers. And then what we've been talking about today, natural enemies. And if we're kind of bringing this all back to the main message here, it's that these natural enemies are promoting their own population at the expense of their host or their prey. any insect out there is going to have at least one natural enemy out there. It could be a bird, it could be an insect, it could be multiple things. And the goal with any sort of beneficial insect or integrated pest management program is not necessarily to kill all of the pests that are out there, because again, if we don't have any pests in the landscape, what are the beneficial insects reproducing off of or feeding on? But we want to reduce numbers of pests to keep them from reaching a pest status. So, you can have, I guess I'll give a better example moving forward here, but we have this concept of biological control, which is like essentially controlling the population of a living organism with another living organism. And it's really purposeful manipulation. So this would be like buying ladybugs and releasing them into your garden in the hopes that they cut down on a pest population. And really what I'm going here, I'm just kind of zooming through this at the very end, but we want to combine all these strategies to achieve essentially a meaningful amount of pest reduction to provide you some sort of goal in the garden. So you could have, let's say you plant tomatoes and that's the only thing that you grow. You don't want to necessarily manage every insect in every case. If it's going to cost you $400 to manage the pests in your garden, but you're only going to lose $20 worth of tomatoes, you don't necessarily want to do anything to preserve your last few tomatoes that you could have saved by spending $400. So biological control, natural enemies, those are all methods that help reduce pest populations to levels that are, quote, tolerable. There's a lot of scientific jargon because I use this talk for multiple different things. So I'm not going to go into density dependent and all that stuff. But the theory of natural enemies, if we're using natural enemies as an augmentative approach to helping reduce natural enemy populations, it's essentially to keep that population below a specific level, which in this graph, we're not going to get into the science of it, it's that little line across, which is called the economic injury level. So if the pest population is above that line, then you're losing money or losing yield or whatever your goal is in the garden. And if you don't have any natural enemies there, that population can kind of go out of control. But if you have a balanced set of natural enemies in the landscape, which is that dashed line, that population is going to explode very quickly in number because there's a lot of pest material present, food, hosts, whatever you want to call it. And then that's going to cut down the population of those pests. And essentially what we want to do here is create a self-sustaining system where the beneficial insects always have something to feed on, and the pest insects are always a little bit present, but they're not high enough population to cause whatever damage in your garden you're most concerned about. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah. Okay. That's the quickest I've zoomed through that, and it made sense, so I'm in good shape. So again, the goal is to create this self-sustaining system. We don't want to eliminate every pest, but we do want to eliminate enough that we can meet our goals in the garden. We don't have to go into the natural enemy stuff here because that's kind of, it's a little bit unrelated. There's different types of like that biological control. There's conservation biological control where you can just plant a lot of different diverse plantings and encourage survival and reproduction of beneficial insects. There's classical biological control, which is like going to a location and physically bringing in a beneficial insect to release. We don't have time to talk about that today. And then augmentative, which is like the example of mass rearing and releasing something into the garden, like the ladybug example. And then I have 2 plugs really quick. If you're really interested in mushrooms, Iowa State University does the Wild Harvested Mushroom Certification course. There's 2 left, and I think there's only 1 registration date open, which is for April 11th. So if you're interested in mushrooms, come take the course. It's really cool. It's taught by my colleague, Dr. Chelsea Harbach, who's a plant pathologist. And then plug number 2, come use the clinic. If you see an insect and you don't know what it is, just send me a picture of it. Pictures often are enough. We have the number in the email down here in the bottom right. We do plant disease diagnostics, insect identification, and some soil stuff, which is mostly for corn and soybean growers if you grow. And that is all I have for you. I have a few minutes for questions. We're kind of right at 2, but I'll take a couple of questions. Here's email address again, website. And if you do ask questions, we just ask that you come to the microphone really quick, if that's okay. That way people online can hear you. Yeah, you could just walk up to the microphone.
So spring has been advancing earlier.
Yep.
And they say you should not be cleaning up debris because of the beneficial insects.
Yeah.
So I guess the question I have, and especially the last few weeks, it's been so nice, everybody wants to clean up their yard. What do you think has it advanced in Iowa, and how much as far as spring cleanup? As far as, I don't want to clean up my yard too quickly because of the insects, possibility of insects there.
Sure.
What's your recommendations?
Yeah, we get that question often, and I appreciate you asking because it's challenging to answer because to some sense there could always be insects still hanging out in that litter that you remove, and like but it could be some pests in there too. So it's like you could remove that material and get rid of some pests like squash bugs, but also get rid of some other beneficials that are overwintering. Honestly, like, because it's kind of an impossible question to give a specific answer to, because every insect comes out of its overwintering diapause at a different time or based on a different stimulus. Sometimes it's day length, where like insects don't become active until there's 14, 15 hours of daylight. And other ones, it's just temperature. If it's above 70 degrees, they're going to become active. So, and this might be a little bit controversial, but usually what I tell people is like, wait as long as you can that feels comfortable for what kind of gardening you're doing. And like, that's long enough. What you can do is that you can like take that material and just like kind of push it off to the side of the yard that you never use. That stuff's acceptable too, but it is kind of an impossible answer because there's so many things that could be in there, and we don't know what's in there or when exactly everything's going to emerge. But just wait as long as it's comfortable to do so is what I normally say. Yeah, great question. Thank you. Yeah.
Are you familiar with the iNaturalist app?
I am, yes. Yep.
Because that was one that was recommended in terms of not only identification, but monitoring the populations of insects and others. Obviously, that would be beneficial to gardeners.
Yep.
The question I had, you had talked about Japanese beetles
Yes.
and how they aren't necessarily killing the plant, but can't they kill a plant as well?
They can. They have the ability.
Yeah.
So when I was talking about not killing the plants, and if I didn't mention this, like that's on me. So like large, like broadleaf trees, they'll often completely defoliate and not kill them. Linden is the prime example in Iowa because they'll just destroy a linden, but the linden will be fine. It'll come back the next year. But for smaller plants, sure. Like if you're working in a smaller garden and they're completely defoliating something that you're growing for production, it can completely ruin that plant for that year. So yeah, for sure. So you have to, it depends on the situation, if you should take action on them or if you shouldn't. The only thing that we recommend is not to put traps up. Have you guys heard this before where you just attract more to your garden, so put it in your neighbor's yard type thing? Yeah. So yeah, they can. So just be mindful. Yeah, thank you. Okay. Any other question? Okay, another one.
How much would beneficial nematodes affect your garden if you purchase them?
Sure. So beneficial nematodes, you guys are going to hear me say this a lot. It depends. So beneficial nematodes can be really useful for some pests, but not others. To give a good example, like I used to work, when I was in Utah, we used to work with greater peach tree borer. And like that is one insect that you can apply beneficial nematodes to and have it actually achieve some amount of control. So it was something that would probably be targeted. Like if you were dealing with one particular pest that was able to be managed with nematode or the assistance of nematodes, then the answer is probably high. But it wouldn't be something that we would just say, buy some nematodes, because you can go online right now and buy what we call entomopathogenic nematodes, which nematodes that kill insects. I would never give the recommendation to just go do that. It would be something that's targeted, like you're dealing with pest XYZ, so greater peach tree borer, for example. I would say this is an acceptable strategy for that particular pest. Go purchase it now. Beneficial nematodes are probably already in the landscape, so it would be something where don't go buy them just because you can, but it could be a strategy that will be useful for certain circumstances. Does that make sense? So they can be very helpful, like in many cases, and they're probably already doing some things in the garden, but not something where we want to just go purchase them and release them just to hope that they help, because they're kind of expensive too. Yeah, good question. Okay, anything else? We have about 10 minutes, yeah? Do you want to say anything? Okay.
Question.
Oh, yeah.
I have a question. Are cicada killers native to Iowa?
Yes, cicada killers are native to Iowa. Everyone loves them? Just me?
I've seen them.
Yeah, so they are native. They're our largest. They're actually, if I go back really far, and this is why it's really hard to learn to identify things. This guy on the right here, so that's in the same family as the cicada killer, but this guy here is probably only half-inch long. So very diverse family. So it's one of our largest wasps in North America. They are native, arguably beneficial. Yeah, I love cicada killers. And also they're one of the other ones that like do that thing where they're scouting them floating above the ground, but like they'll never come after you. And if one does, like send it to me and yeah, I do this thing where I call our freezer camp. So like if I ever have to like kill an insect to like identify it, I'm like, oh, we're gonna send it off to freezer camp, which is like summer camp, and it just helps me feel a little bit better. So if you find a cicada killer that actually comes after you, like just send it to me. I'll take care of it.
Thank you, Zach.
Thanks.